"Don't embarrass yourself," my sister whispered before my speech. I trembled as I walked to the stage. Years later, she was in the audience when I gave a TED talk. The crowd stood in ovation. I looked at her and said, "Sometimes embarrassment grows into legacy." Nathan Palmer had always felt most at home in quiet places, corners of the school library, where dust floated in golden shafts of afternoon light, or on the back porch of his parents' house in rural Ohio, where he could listen to the rustle of leaves and the hum of cicadas. At 16 years old, he was a high school junior with a quiet presence and an easy-to-miss demeanor. He wasn't unpopular, just invisible, the kind of student teachers appreciated for not causing trouble, and classmates barely noticed outside of group projects. His passion was stories, not the kind told aloud, but the kind tucked in worn pages and scribbled notebooks. So when his homeroom teacher announced that each class needed a representative for the upcoming school-wide speech competition, and that Nathan had been nominated by majority vote, a confused murmur spread through the room. Nathan blinked up from his notebook, unaware of the nomination. His palms immediately began to sweat. He looked around, expecting someone to explain it was a joke, but no one said anything. His teacher smiled encouragingly. "Nathan, you'll do great," she said. "The topic is bullying. You're thoughtful, that matters." He didn't remember agreeing. Somehow the paper was handed to him to sign. The deadline was 2 weeks away. That night, over dinner, his family responded with a mix of surprise and amusement. His father chuckled, saying, "Didn't know you had a voice for crowds." His mother looked concerned but encouraging. Then there was Claire. Claire, 17 and everything Nathan wasn't, raised an eyebrow from across the table. Confident, athletic, sharp-tongued, and always dressed like she had somewhere better to be, Claire had a way of making her opinions felt even in silence. She twirled her fork and smirked. "Just don't embarrass yourself, okay?" she said almost playfully. Almost. Nathan tried to laugh it off, but the words clung to him. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of anxiety. He wrote and rewrote his speech a dozen times. His fingers trembled each time he tried to practice aloud. In his room, in front of the mirror, his voice faltered. Every sentence felt too soft, too unsure. His thoughts scattered. He imagined the audience, hundreds of students packed into the school auditorium. He imagined the hush before he spoke, the silence if he failed. On the morning of the competition, he barely touched his breakfast. His mother offered a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Claire, dressed sharply for her student council duties, gave him a look that was hard to read. "You'll be fine," she said. "Just don't let them see you panic." He walked to school in a haze, his speech folded and refolded in his pocket, now soft at the creases. When his name was called, he walked backstage and waited. He could hear the clapping for the speaker before him. The assistant principal leaned in and whispered, "You're next, Nathan, you'll do great." He wasn't so sure. As he stepped toward the curtain, Claire, seated in the front row with the student council, leaned slightly toward the aisle. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She just said under her breath and just loud enough for him to hear, "Don't embarrass yourself." Something inside him froze. His feet moved mechanically. He walked onto the stage under a white spotlight that seemed to magnify his every breath. The microphone loomed before him. He swallowed, unfolded the paper, and looked at the crowd. His heart thudded violently in his chest. For a moment, everything was silent. Too silent. He opened his mouth. The words didn't come. He cleared his throat, tried again, and finally shakily began the first sentence. It came out thin and unsteady. He mispronounced a word, then lost his place. His hands shook as he tried to refocus on the page. He looked up, searching for a familiar face. Claire's expression was blank. No encouragement, just waiting. Halfway through the speech, he stumbled completely. A full sentence dropped out of his head. There was a pause, long enough to be noticed. Then a quiet cough from the audience. Someone snickered. Heat rose to his face. He skipped 3 lines and rushed to the closing sentence, barely audible. "Thank you." There was a smattering of polite applause. He turned and walked off the stage as fast as he could. Behind him, the next speaker was already being introduced. He didn't go back to the audience. He slipped into the hallway, leaned against the cool lockers, and tried to breathe. His face burned. His hands shook. And somewhere deep inside, something quietly cracked. He didn't cry, not then. But he didn't speak much for the rest of the day either. In the days that followed, no one bullied him outright. But the silence was loud. A few classmates whispered. A few mimicked his stumble. Claire didn't mention it. She didn't have to. What lingered most wasn't the failure. It was the echo of her voice. Don't embarrass yourself. And yet, even then, something unspoken began to stir. Not confidence, not defiance, just the faintest flicker of refusal. A whisper inside himself, different from hers and not yet strong enough to be heard, but there, waiting. The following days at school unfolded with a strange kind of quietness. No one openly mocked Nathan, but he could feel the weight of glances. Laughter in the hallway that had nothing to do with him still made his shoulders tense, as if anticipating another reminder of the humiliation he had endured on stage. He tried to act like it had never happened, walking with his head down, slipping into classrooms early, keeping to the corners of every room. It was not the public embarrassment that carved itself into his memory. It was the slow erosion of certainty afterward. Nathan had always believed that if he stayed quiet, avoided trouble, kept to his books and thoughts, the world would leave him alone. That belief crumbled the moment his voice cracked in front of 200 students and teachers. The silence that followed him down the hallway was worse than the brief snickers. It was the absence of recognition, of sympathy, of anyone saying, "You did your best." Not even Claire spoke of it again. Her silence was louder than laughter. At home, dinner conversations moved on quickly. His parents assumed it was a learning experience, something to reflect on and forget. His mother asked once, "Did it go okay?" To which he nodded, eyes downcast. Claire never mentioned the speech. Not once. Nathan could not decide which would have hurt more, her ridicule or her indifference. She didn't seem cruel, only uninterested. And maybe that made it worse. To her, it had been a forgettable moment. For Nathan, it was the day he felt himself sink into the ground. At school, he began to avoid the areas where people gathered. The cafeteria became too exposed, so he took to eating lunch in the library, hiding behind tall shelves with a sandwich and a book he barely read. He spent hours pretending to study, just to escape the awkward interactions, the knowing looks. One afternoon, he heard someone from a different table say, "He's the one from the stage thing," followed by a whisper and muffled laugh. It wasn't meant to be cruel, it wasn't even said loudly, but it landed in his chest like a stone. He began sleeping with his headphones on, not to listen to music, but to block out the sound of his thoughts. The memory of standing on that stage, hands trembling, voice catching, forgetting lines he had memorized for weeks. It played on repeat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the spotlight, the rows of faces, and Claire's expressionless gaze from the front row. She hadn't even clapped. His notebook, once a place where he scribbled idle thoughts, became something more. He didn't write speeches or essays anymore. He wrote the things he wished he had said. He wrote about how afraid he had been, how alone he felt, how no one understood the weight of having to speak when silence had always been his shield. The pages filled quickly, not with well-formed sentences, but with raw, messy thoughts. He didn't plan them. They spilled out. There was one line he wrote again and again in different ways. "It's not the failure that broke me. It's feeling like I failed alone." Still, somewhere between the dread and disappointment, there was a shift. He stopped trying to forget what had happened and started to understand why it mattered so much. Nathan realized it wasn't just about public speaking, it was about visibility. For the first time, people had looked at him, and he had looked back, only to wish he could disappear. He hated that feeling, and he feared it would never leave. One evening, he found himself sitting on the porch steps, notebook in hand, the fading sun casting long shadows across the lawn. Claire walked by, dressed in her usual confidence, heading out with friends. She paused just a second, glanced at him, then asked, "Still writing in that thing?" He didn't look up. "Yeah." She shrugged. "Okay." The door clicked shut behind her, and Nathan sat there for a long time, wondering why her voice still echoed in his head, more than the voice of anyone else. "Don't embarrass yourself." It had sounded like a warning, but now it felt like something else. A prophecy he had fulfilled, one that haunted him because he had believed it the moment she said it. He didn't blame her. Not fully. But the weight of those words lingered. The rest of the semester passed slowly. Nathan did his work, kept to himself, avoided assemblies and any event that required standing in front of others. Teachers noticed his withdrawal, but he was still turning in assignments, still getting decent grades, so no one intervened. He was functional, but inside, something remained cracked. He watched Claire thrive, elected to another student council position, leading meetings, organizing fundraisers. She lived in a world Nathan couldn't touch, one where speaking up wasn't terrifying, but exhilarating. He envied her, even as he resented the effortless way she moved through life. They were close in age, but it felt like a canyon separated them. One night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Nathan flipped through his notebook. Most of what he had written was too personal, too scattered, but there were moments of clarity, lines that didn't feel like complaints but like insights. He read one aloud to himself. The most terrifying part of that stage wasn't forgetting my words. It was realizing that I didn't believe anyone wanted to hear them in the first place. He stared at that sentence. It rang true in a way that made his chest ache. Still, he kept writing. The act itself became a small rebellion, a way of reclaiming what had felt lost. He didn't know it then, but something quiet and persistent had started to form beneath the surface. Not confidence, not yet, but maybe resilience, the kind that grows slowly, in silence, like roots beneath frozen ground. He didn't tell anyone about the writing. He didn't try to read it aloud. He didn't imagine standing on another stage, but he no longer wanted to erase the memory. And that was the first sign that the moment hadn't broken him completely. It had only bent him, and in that bend, something new was beginning to take shape. The winter after the speech competition passed in a grey hush. Snow fell steadily over the small town, muffling everything beneath a blanket of stillness. Nathan watched it from his bedroom window, notebook on his lap, pencil poised but unmoving. The world outside seemed frozen, and inside him the same chill lingered. But somewhere in that stillness, something fragile began to stir. The humiliation from the failed speech never truly faded. It lingered not as a sharp pain, but as a dull ache, a bruise that didn't show but never stopped pulsing. Yet as the days went by, Nathan found himself returning to that moment, not to relive the fear, but to make sense of it. He wrote about the silence, the panic, the burning in his throat when his voice failed, and strangely, the more he wrote, the less power those memories held over him. They were still painful, but now they had form, shape, language. His notebook filled faster than ever. At first it was only fragments, single lines, half-thoughts, questions he couldn't answer. Then it turned into stories. He created characters who stood on stages and forgot their lines, who failed and ran away, who carried quiet shame like a second skin. But these characters, unlike him, found ways to rise. Writing gave him control he hadn't felt that day in the auditorium. On the page, he wasn't afraid. What surprised him most was how deeply he needed the act of writing. It wasn't just about expression. It was survival. No one knew he was doing it. He kept his journal tucked beneath his mattress, hidden even from Claire, especially from Claire. Her presence in his life was as steady and loud as ever. She came and went like a whirlwind, arguing with their parents, laughing with friends on the phone, leaving half-drunk iced coffees on the kitchen counter. Her world spun fast, vibrant, always moving forward. Nathan's world stayed still, yet he found himself writing about her too. Not cruelly, but with the honesty he couldn't voice out loud. He wrote about how her words that morning had hurt, about how much he had longed for a kind glance from her as he stood on that stage. He even wrote a short letter he never intended to send, imagining a version of her that might read it and understand. But when he finished, he folded it and tucked it away. One afternoon, while organizing books at the library, his English teacher, Miss Barlow, passed by and glanced at the notebook he had accidentally left open. She didn't read the pages, but she smiled at the sight of them. "You've always had a way with words," she said casually before moving on. Nathan didn't respond, but her words clung to him, not like Claire's had, but gently, like a hand offered without demand. He began to wonder what it would mean to share his words, not aloud, not yet, but maybe one day. The idea both thrilled and terrified him. As spring approached, the school announced a creative writing contest. Posters were pinned in the halls and bulletin boards, with bright letters calling for poems, essays, and stories. Nathan stared at the flyer each time he passed it. Part of him wanted to crumple it and throw it away. Another part, it barely had a voice, wondered if this was a chance. Not for redemption, but for presence. He didn't decide right away. Days passed. The deadline loomed. On the night before submissions were due, he opened his notebook and read through everything he had written since the failed speech. Some of it was messy, some of it deeply personal. But one short story stood out. It was about a boy who lived in a house where no one listened to the sounds he made, so he built a machine to record them, not to share, but to prove to himself they had existed. The story wasn't polished, but it was his. He typed it, printed it, and slipped it into the submission box just before the bell rang. He didn't tell anyone. 2 weeks later, during second period, the announcement came. This year's winner of the creative writing contest is Nathan Palmer, Jr., for his short story, The Sound Collector. There was a pause in the classroom. Several heads turned. Someone said, "Who's Nathan?" Others murmured in surprise. Nathan sat frozen in his seat. His teacher looked pleasantly surprised. He managed a stiff smile. He didn't hear the rest of the announcements. That afternoon, Ms. Barlow pulled him aside after class. "You should be proud," she said. "Your voice is quieter than most, but that doesn't mean it's not powerful." He nodded, unsure what to say. At home, Claire mentioned it in passing. "Saw your name on the announcement board," she said. "Didn't know you could write." She said it like she was complimenting a stranger. Nathan shrugged. "I guess I can," he replied. She didn't say more, but for once her voice held no sarcasm. That night he took out his notebook and wrote a new line. "Even silence has echoes if you listen long enough." The speech had broken something in him, yes, but it had also opened a door he hadn't known existed. Behind that door was a part of himself he had never dared to explore. A part that believed, however quietly, that his words could matter. He wasn't ready to speak again. Not yet. But he was writing. And sometimes that was enough. The final bell of junior year rang on a humid May afternoon, echoing down the tiled hallways as students burst out of classrooms in waves of relief. Nathan walked slower than most, his backpack slung over one shoulder, notebook in hand. The weight of the school year didn't lift as easily for him as it did for others. He still carried the memory of that moment on stage, the way his voice had collapsed under pressure, and how the silence that followed had shaped him into someone quieter still. But there had been something else growing beneath that memory. Winning the writing contest hadn't changed everything, but it had nudged something open. It had given him a glimpse into a part of himself he had always kept hidden. And though few had celebrated his win beyond a brief mention at the spring assembly, Nathan felt something shift inside when he saw his name printed in the school newsletter beneath the title, The Sound Collector. During summer break, he kept writing. He filled another notebook and started a third. He wrote early in the morning before the house woke up, and late at night when even Claire's footsteps had faded upstairs. He wrote not for an audience, but because it gave him space. A place to be heard, even if only by himself. When senior year began, Nathan made a quiet decision to say yes to more things that scared him, just not on stage. One of those things was joining the school's debate club. He had passed by the club's meeting flyer several times before finally writing down the room number. On the day of the first meeting, he stood outside the classroom for almost 10 minutes, pretending to read a notice board before taking a breath and stepping inside. The room was filled with energy, students talking, laughing, stacking folders, and arranging desks into a semicircle. Nathan hovered at the edge until a student noticed him and waved him in. "You here for debate?" she asked. He nodded. "Cool. Sit anywhere." He took a seat near the back and listened. The meeting was nothing like he'd expected. Instead of aggressive shouting or dramatic arguments, it was structured, thoughtful, and unexpectedly collaborative. The coach, a young history teacher named Mr. Kellner, introduced the team and explained how the roles worked: speakers, researchers, and writers. Nathan's ears perked at the word writer. After the meeting, he approached Mr. Kellner. "Do you need help writing arguments?" Mr. Kellner smiled. "Always." "You any good at it?" "I like writing," Nathan said, which was the closest he had come to bragging in years. And so he became the quiet engine behind the team. He didn't speak in tournaments, didn't attend the stage events, but he spent hours crafting cases, researching statistics, helping refine the tone and flow of arguments. His teammates learned to appreciate his calm focus and thoughtful suggestions. Over time, his presence became dependable. He was still not widely known in school, but within that room he had a role. He watched others debate with a mix of admiration and fear. The idea of standing in front of a judge and speaking still sent a cold wave down his spine. But something strange happened as he worked closely with the team. He started practicing aloud, not in front of them, but in empty classrooms during lunch or after school when no one was around. He'd take one of the speeches he had written, stand behind a desk, and read it aloud, trying to imagine himself in front of a panel. At first, his voice quivered, but the more he read, the steadier it became. One day he stayed late, alone in the library study room, and timed himself delivering an opening argument he had written for an upcoming tournament. His hands trembled slightly, but the words came easier now. He paced, gestured, even made eye contact with invisible judges. He finished breathless but energized. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it. He didn't plan to speak in public again. Not yet. But the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be felt just a little smaller each time he stood behind that imaginary podium. Ms. Barlow noticed the change in him before most did. She saw the way he walked with a little more certainty, the way he lingered after class to ask questions. One afternoon she handed him a book, an anthology of essays from famous speeches. "You might like this," she said, "not just for the content, but for the way they structure thought." Nathan accepted the book, running his fingers over the embossed cover. He opened to a random page and read a line that stopped him. "The voice does not have to be loud to carry weight." That sentence stayed with him. He read the book in 2 days. Still, he did not share what he was doing. Not with Ms. Barlow, not with Claire. Especially not with Claire. She still treated him like the same quiet brother. They coexisted peacefully. She had her world, and he had his. Occasionally she'd ask, "Still doing that writing thing?" but never waited for a real answer. Nathan didn't offer one, but he kept showing up to debate club. He kept researching. He kept practicing behind closed doors. He began to record himself reading speeches on his phone, listening back, cringing at every pause and every rushed sentence. Yet he kept at it. He adjusted his tone, slowed down, paused for effect. It became a quiet ritual. Him, the empty room, and the sound of a voice he was slowly learning to trust. He still remembered the sting of standing on stage, still felt the shadow of that moment in the auditorium whenever he passed it in the hallway. But now that memory no longer defined him. It lingered, yes, but as a point of origin, not an ending. He was trying again, far from the spotlight, but not from himself. The winter of Nathan's senior year brought with it a strange stillness, not the kind that numbed, but the kind that allowed things to settle in place. He had grown more comfortable in his routines, showing up for debate club meetings, contributing to research with quiet diligence, and continuing his solo speech practices in vacant classrooms and echoing hallways. Still, no one knew. No one had heard him speak out loud, not really. But for the first time, Nathan began to wonder if he wanted someone to. Miss Barlow, his English teacher, had always been a constant. She had taught him since sophomore year, never loud or overly sentimental, but firm in the way she believed in her students. Nathan wasn't sure when she started paying closer attention to him, but she had a way of noticing things without making them feel invasive. It wasn't just that she remembered what he wrote. It was that she saw who he was behind the sentences. One afternoon, after school let out early due to unexpected snowfall, Nathan stayed behind in his usual hideaway, a small AV room off the library. He had grown accustomed to the ritual, stand at the front, imagine a crowd, deliver the argument or reflection he had written that week. This time, he was practicing a speech for a mock event the debate team was organizing for practice. He didn't plan to participate publicly, but he had written one of the key speeches and wanted to hear how it sounded aloud. He was halfway through when he heard a voice behind him. "You've got rhythm. Your pacing is good." He froze. Turning slowly, he saw Ms. Barlow standing in the doorway, arms crossed lightly, a patient expression on her face. He didn't know how long she had been there. Embarrassment surged to the surface, the same cold flush he had felt on that stage years ago. His voice dried up. "You don't have to explain," she said gently, stepping inside. I've walked past this room a few times after school, heard your voice a couple times. I was curious, that's all. Nathan looked down. It's just practice. I don't really do this publicly. I can tell, she replied, not unkindly. But I also think you want to. Otherwise, you wouldn't keep coming back here. He didn't know what to say. She approached the front of the room and took a seat on one of the folding chairs. Go ahead, keep going. I'll sit here. You don't have to perform. Just talk, like I'm not even here. He hesitated, the pages in his hand trembling slightly. But something about the way she waited, not expectantly but patiently, made it easier to breathe. He lifted the paper, took a deep breath, and began again. The words were familiar by now, but with someone listening, every syllable felt exposed. He stumbled twice, paused once for longer than he meant to, but made it through. When he finished, he looked up. Ms. Barlow didn't clap. She didn't offer empty praise. She just nodded. You have something real in your voice. Don't worry about being loud. That's not where the strength comes from. She stood and added, if you ever want help refining your delivery, or just someone to sit in while you practice, I'll be here after school most days. Just knock. That was it. She left him standing there, pages still in hand. It took him 3 days to build the courage to return. When he finally did, she was in her classroom grading papers. He hovered at the door until she looked up. Ready? She asked. He nodded, and so began something unexpected. Once a week, sometimes twice, Nathan would meet with her after school. Sometimes he would read. Sometimes they would dissect what he had written, what worked, what didn't, where his voice dropped or rushed. Ms. Barlow was never harsh, but she never let him coast. She challenged his sentences, pushed him to find the center of what he wanted to say, to speak not from safety, but from clarity. She told him stories about her own life, but only when they fit the moment. She had once been afraid of public speaking too, though it was hard to imagine. She had overcome it not by silencing the fear, but by becoming so familiar with her material that it overpowered the nerves. Preparation, she emphasized, was the key. Not memorization, connection. What you're afraid of isn't failure, she said one afternoon, leaning back in her chair. It's being seen. That's different, and a lot more powerful when you learn to embrace it. Nathan took those words to heart. The more he practiced, the more he stopped fearing the sound of his own voice. His delivery still lacked the polish of seasoned speakers, but it carried something deeper: honesty. He began recording full speeches and analyzing them, marking where his voice cracked or his gaze dropped. Each week brought subtle improvement, a stronger posture, a steadier tone. Still, he never performed publicly, until one afternoon, during a routine session, Ms. Barlow looked up from her notes and said, "You know the youth event at the community center next month?" Nathan nodded. It was a local gathering for teens, hosted every spring. His sister Claire had spoken there once during her sophomore year. Well, one of the speakers cancelled. They're looking for a replacement. He didn't like where this was going. I told them I might know someone, she continued. Someone who has a voice that deserves to be heard. His heart dropped. I'm not ready. You might not feel ready, but you've been ready for a while. He shook his head. It's different here. In this room I can handle it. Out there, it's not the same. I'll be in the front row, she said, if you say yes. He didn't respond that day. It took a week, 7 days of pacing, writing, deleting, rewriting, reading his own words in the mirror, 7 nights of barely sleeping. But on the 8th morning, he knocked on her classroom door and said, "Okay, I'll try." Ms. Barlow smiled, not triumphantly, but with a quiet pride that told him this had never been about the event. It had always been about him choosing to step forward. They met more frequently after that. She helped him structure the speech, refine the message, trim the excess, but she never once told him what to say. She only helped him say what he already knew. The night before the event, Nathan stood in his room, looking at his reflection. His hands trembled, but his eyes didn't waver. He whispered a sentence to himself, one he had written weeks ago. It's not about being fearless. It's about speaking anyway. He didn't sleep much, but this time he wasn't afraid of being seen. He was ready to be heard. The community center stood at the edge of town, a squat brick building with wide windows and posters taped crookedly to the inside glass. Nathan had driven past it countless times, but had never once imagined himself stepping onto the small stage inside. That stage, barely 2 feet above the ground and no wider than a classroom chalkboard, would become the site of something he couldn't have predicted just a few months earlier. The invitation had come in a rush. Ms. Barlow had called him late on a Thursday evening, her voice calm but urgent. The scheduled youth speaker for the event had fallen ill. The organizers were desperate. She had suggested Nathan. They had agreed. He had less than a week to prepare. The panic was immediate. As soon as he hung up, the old fear returned. The choking silence of the school auditorium, the eyes in the crowd, the spotlight that had made his mind go blank. He hadn't performed in public since that day. And yet, unlike before, this time there was something that kept him from saying no outright. It wasn't confidence, it wasn't obligation. It was the simple knowledge that he had something to say. Whether or not his voice shook, the words themselves mattered. He met with Ms. Barlow the next afternoon. "They're expecting someone with experience," he told her, pacing the length of the classroom. "I've never even—" "You've written speeches for others," she reminded him. "You've practiced. You've stood in this room, alone, and delivered truth with more honesty than most people can manage in a lifetime. But no one's ever watched. They will, and you'll survive it." That night, he pulled out every note, outline, and recording he had saved over the past few months. Fragments of ideas, paragraphs from old journals, sentences that had come to him at 3 o'clock in the morning. He laid them across his desk and floor like puzzle pieces. Somewhere inside them was a speech. The topic was open. The audience would be made up of teenagers, parents, teachers, and community leaders. He thought about writing something safe, something abstract and academic. But when he sat down to type, what came out surprised even him. He wrote about failure. He wrote about the day his voice cracked in front of an auditorium, about the weeks he had spent hiding, and about the silence that followed him like a shadow. But he didn't stop there. He wrote about discovery too, how writing had become his lifeline, how words written in secret had shown him something he never knew he needed. He wrote about Ms. Barlow, though he didn't name her. He wrote about trying again, not with certainty, but with intention. The speech took shape over 3 days. He read it aloud every night, refining the rhythm, adjusting the phrasing. He marked pauses and breathing points. He recorded himself on his phone, listened back, and winced at the imperfections. But he kept going. The night before the event, he stood in his room facing the mirror. He held the paper but didn't look at it. His hands didn't tremble as much as they used to. His voice still wavered in places, but it never stopped. At breakfast the next morning, Claire noticed him dressed more formally than usual. "You got somewhere to be?" she asked. He nodded. "Speaking at the youth event." She paused, surprised. "Since when?" "Since 4 days ago." She didn't respond at first. Then, in a voice that held no trace of sarcasm, she said, "Good luck." That was all. But it meant more than she knew. At the community center, he arrived early. The hall was filled with folding chairs, rows of them, each one waiting to hold a stranger's attention. A few staff members adjusted cables and checked microphones. Ms. Barlow arrived not long after. She wore her usual navy coat and carried a folder under her arm. "You ready?" she asked. He didn't say yes, he said, "I will be." She smiled. "Then you are." As people began to arrive, Nathan found a quiet corner and watched them. Parents, teachers, teenagers with crossed arms and skeptical faces. It didn't matter. He wasn't there to impress. He was there to speak. That was the difference. When his name was called, he stepped forward. The walk to the stage was short, but felt impossibly long. The lights overhead were not as bright as those in the school auditorium, but they still cast a subtle glare. The microphone stood at chest height, and he adjusted it slightly, his fingertips cold. He looked out at the crowd, not huge, not intimidating, but real. He began. His voice was soft at first, but steady. He told them about a boy who once stood in front of his entire school and forgot everything. A boy who was so afraid of being seen that he tried to vanish afterward. He didn't name himself, but it didn't take long for the audience to understand. He didn't hide his fear. He told them what it felt like to fail in public, and how that failure became something else over time. Not a wound, but a turning point. He talked about writing, about how words written in secret were the first steps toward understanding himself. He spoke of the teachers who listened, the empty rooms where he practiced, and the voice that had always been there, waiting for permission. As he reached the final paragraph, he no longer looked at his notes. I used to think speaking was about being brave, about standing up tall and being unshakable, but I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up, even when your voice shakes. Sometimes the courage isn't in the strength, it's in the willingness. There was a moment of silence when he finished, then applause. Not polite, but genuine. A few people stood. He couldn't see all of them through the lights, but he saw Ms. Barlow. She was standing. Nathan stepped off the stage and exhaled. His hands were damp, his shirt clinging slightly to his back. But he wasn't trembling, not the way he had been before. He didn't seek out compliments. He didn't linger. But as he moved through the crowd, a few people stopped him. A teacher he didn't know said, "That was honest, we need more of that." A teenager, younger than him by 2 or 3 years, simply said, "Thanks." Those words stayed with him longer than the applause. Later that night at home, he didn't write about what had happened. He didn't need to. It wasn't about preserving the moment. It was about knowing it had occurred and that it mattered. He had spoken, he had been heard, and nothing about him had broken. The applause from the community center did not echo forever. By the next morning, the world moved on, as it always does. People returned to their routines, and the folding chairs were stacked and tucked away. The stage where Nathan had delivered his first real public speech was empty once more, waiting for the next voice. But something in Nathan had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irrevocably. He didn't tell many people about the event. Ms. Barlow knew, of course, and Claire had asked briefly how it went. "Fine," he had replied, and she had nodded, as if unsure how far she was allowed to go with the conversation. But when he returned to school the following Monday, Nathan felt a subtle shift in the way he carried himself. His shoulders sat higher. His eyes met more faces. No one knew why, but they noticed it all the same. What stayed with him most from that evening wasn't the applause, but the conversations afterward. The brief thanks from strangers, the way their words had no pretense. They hadn't praised his performance. They had responded to the message. For the first time, Nathan felt that his voice had traveled beyond the room, that it had landed somewhere inside others and left a mark. He returned to debate club with renewed focus. Though he still didn't take the stage at tournaments, his speeches became stronger, more precise. When he handed them to the student speakers, they noticed, "You always make this sound like a real story," one of them said, "not just data." He didn't respond aloud, but the words stayed with him. Ms. Barlow continued to mentor him, but she stepped back more often, letting him take the lead. "You know what you want to say now," she told him during one of their last sessions. "You just have to keep choosing to say it." That spring, a small but unexpected opportunity arrived. A nearby high school was hosting a workshop on youth leadership and storytelling. Ms. Barlow forwarded the invitation to Nathan, suggesting he attend, not as a speaker, but as a participant. He was hesitant at first. It felt like starting over in a place where no one knew his history, his failures or his quiet victories. But he signed up. The workshop took place on a rainy Saturday. The building was plain, the rooms unremarkable. But inside, a group of teenagers gathered, each carrying stories waiting to be told. The facilitators encouraged honesty, vulnerability, and above all, connection. There were writing exercises, small group sessions, and impromptu storytelling circles. When it came time for volunteers to share something aloud, Nathan surprised himself by raising his hand. He didn't read from a page. He spoke from memory, recounting the story of the boy who froze on stage, and how that moment, instead of ending something, had begun something else entirely. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatize. And yet, when he finished, the group sat silent for a moment before offering soft, deliberate applause. Later, a girl from another school approached him. "I thought I was the only one who felt like that," she said. "You made it feel normal, like it's okay to mess up." That sentence lit something in Nathan he hadn't known he needed. The realization that his story had value beyond himself, that even if it wasn't perfect, even if it came with cracks and nerves and pauses, it could offer comfort to someone else. It was the first time he believed, truly believed, that his voice could do more than survive. It could matter. That night, he began drafting a new piece. Not for school, not for debate, not for Miss Barlow, just for himself. It was a letter to his past self, addressed to the boy who had walked off the auditorium stage in silence and shame. He wrote it slowly, carefully. Each word was both an apology and an offering. "You're going to carry this moment for a long time," he wrote, "but one day it will carry you." He didn't know what he would do with the letter, but writing it felt like completing a circle. By the time graduation approached, Nathan had begun to think about the future differently. He still didn't picture himself as a traditional public speaker, commanding large stages with booming confidence. But he no longer feared the idea of being seen. He had found a rhythm to his voice, a quiet, steady truth that resonated deeper than volume ever could. His parents, always supportive but never fully understanding the weight of his journey, congratulated him on finishing strong. Claire, in a rare moment of openness, said, "You've changed a lot this year." He didn't know how to respond, but she didn't seem to expect an answer. She said it without condescension, almost like admiration. That summer, he applied to a few colleges, focusing on programs in writing, communication, and education. In his personal statement, he didn't write about academic achievements. He wrote about the speech he gave that no one clapped for, and then about the one they did. He wrote about silence, fear, and the slow path towards self-trust. He wrote like someone who understood that a story is not made in the moments when things go well, but in how we respond when they don't. One of the colleges he applied to sent back a handwritten note with his acceptance letter. "Your voice is necessary," it read. "We hope you'll continue sharing it." Nathan kept that note pinned above his desk for weeks. It reminded him that belief, once sparked, doesn't have to be loud. It just has to endure. College began with the same kind of uncertainty that had marked so many of Nathan's transitions. The campus was larger than any place he had spent time before, sprawling and full of voices that didn't hesitate to speak. Students walked quickly, held conversations across crowded paths, joined groups and clubs without hesitation. Nathan, carrying a worn notebook and a backpack that felt too heavy, moved through the noise with cautious steps. He had chosen a mid-sized liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, one known for its writing program and small seminar-style classes. It wasn't the most prestigious option he had been offered, but it was the one that felt most aligned with who he was trying to become. A place that valued stories, even quiet ones. His first few weeks were disorienting. Professors asked questions with no warning. Classmates debated literature with the kind of ease Nathan only found when writing alone. The anonymity of being new offered a kind of safety. No one knew his history. No one had seen him fall. But it also came with isolation. The routines he had built in high school didn't follow him here. The support systems were gone, and the blank slate was more intimidating than freeing. Still, he kept writing. He joined the campus literary journal, not as a contributor at first, but as a reader. He reviewed submissions late at night in the dimly lit student union, pencil in hand, eyes scanning for pieces that carried truth. Most didn't. A few surprised him. One, about a young man watching his childhood home be demolished, made him pause. He wrote a thoughtful note of acceptance and sent it back through the editorial chain. In his writing seminar, he shared a short, personal essay about the time he froze on stage. The professor, a sharp but fair man named Dr. Levin, returned the piece with few comments but circled one line in red ink. "Sometimes your voice breaks because it's been quiet for too long." Beside it, he wrote, "That's your center. Start there." Nathan revised the essay 10 times. Then, with some hesitation, he submitted it to a statewide student speaker program. It was a competitive initiative that selected a small group of undergraduates each year to present short talks on topics of personal significance at various universities and high schools. The prize was modest, but the recognition could be meaningful. Ms. Barlow had mentioned the program to him before he left for college, urging him to consider it when he felt ready. He submitted the essay and a brief application, careful not to overstate his experience. Then he waited. Weeks passed. Midterms came and went. Fall broke into a cold stretch of gray skies and bare trees. Nathan checked his email daily, then hourly. Each time he saw nothing, he told himself it was fine. He didn't expect anything. He wasn't sure he even deserved it. Still, when the reply finally came, short, formal, regretful, it hit harder than he anticipated. Dear Mr. Palmer, thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, we are unable to offer you a position in this year's cohort. He reread the email twice, then shut his laptop and sat still for a long time. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the sensation of having stretched yourself, just slightly, and being told gently to retract. The rejection didn't come with humiliation, but with silence. And that silence brought back echoes of earlier failures. For a day or two, he let it settle in. Then, late one evening, he opened his notebook and began to write. Not about the rejection, but about what it felt like to risk something and be turned away. He wrote about what it meant to try in a world that didn't always respond. He didn't try to spin it. He didn't frame it as a hidden blessing. He just told the truth. When he finished, he read the essay aloud in his dorm room, the same way he used to in high school when no one was listening. On impulse, he posted it to a modest personal blog he had started over the summer, a place he had named Silent Courage. Until then, it had housed only a few quiet reflections. Nothing with traction. Nothing he expected anyone to find. But this time, something different happened. The post was shared, first by a fellow student, then by a teaching assistant, then by someone Nathan didn't know. The essay began to circulate among small circles, writing groups, school counselors, even a community forum for young speakers. The response wasn't viral, but it was visible. Dozens of comments appeared. Strangers wrote back, thanking him for putting into words what they had struggled to express. One reader simply wrote, "I needed this today." Nathan didn't know how to respond. He had failed, and somehow the failure had carried his voice farther than any success had done so far. Encouraged by the response, he posted again a week later, this time about the pressures of being articulate when your thoughts come more slowly than your peers. The next post followed 2 weeks later, reflecting on the paradox of building confidence in private. Each piece resonated more than the last. Eventually, a college counselor emailed him, "I've been following your blog. Would you consider visiting a writing group at a local high school to talk about finding your voice?" It was not a stage, it was not a competition, but it was an invitation. Nathan agreed. The high school was only a short drive away. When he arrived, a dozen students sat around a long table, notebooks open, eyes curious. He didn't bring slides. He didn't prepare a formal lecture. He simply told them about the rejection, the writing, the silence that had once defined him. He told them that not every opportunity would open its door, but that sometimes the voice that gets turned away is the one most needed somewhere else. Afterward, one of the students lingered and said, "I hate speaking out loud, but when you talked, it didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like you were just telling the truth." Nathan nodded. "That's all I'm trying to do." And as he walked out into the cold afternoon, he realized something with more clarity than ever before. A step back is not the end of the path. Sometimes it is the place where the next part of the climb begins. By the start of his second year in college, Nathan was no longer invisible. He wasn't the loudest in the room, nor the most charismatic, but something about the quiet steadiness of his presence had begun to register with others. Professors called on him more frequently, not because he dominated discussions, but because when he did speak, his words carried weight. Classmates sought his input on group projects, often deferring to his ability to shape ideas into something coherent and purposeful. The boy who once flinched at the thought of being noticed now found himself at the center of conversations that mattered. His blog, Silent Courage, had grown steadily over the previous months. What had started as a personal outlet had become a space where young people from across the country returned weekly to read his reflections. Nathan didn't write with strategy or for clicks. He wrote what he needed to say, and in doing so he seemed to write what others needed to hear. Each post carried a signature tone, honest, measured, never overly polished but always intentional. His audience appreciated the vulnerability. His voice, though soft, had begun to resonate. Eventually, a student organization on campus invited him to speak at a panel on personal growth. The event was modest, held in a lecture hall with folding chairs and a small microphone. Nathan accepted, his hands no longer trembling as they once had. When he walked onto the stage, he didn't read from a page. He spoke freely, drawing from the path he had taken. The first speech that broke him, the quiet years that followed, the stories that slowly rebuilt his voice. "I used to think silence was safer," he told the room. "But what I've learned is that silence can be heavy. Sometimes we stay quiet not because we have nothing to say, but because we don't believe our words will matter. I write because I never want anyone to feel like that again." The room was still when he finished. Then, as had become familiar, the applause came, not roaring, not raucous, but respectful, real. From that point forward, invitations began to arrive more frequently. Not grand stages, but meaningful ones. A nearby community college asked him to lead a workshop for students dealing with public speaking anxiety. A regional youth advocacy conference offered him a guest slot to share his experience. A podcast host reached out, having discovered silent courage, and asked him to record an interview about the evolution of personal voice. Each time he stood before an audience or turned on a microphone, Nathan returned to the same internal foundation. He didn't try to impress. He didn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. He spoke like a person who had once sat in the back of a room, afraid to be seen, and now stood only because he had something to share. Claire noticed the changes, even if she rarely commented on them. She followed his blog quietly, sometimes liking posts but never leaving comments. One evening during a visit home, she mentioned the podcast he had recorded. "You sounded different," she said. "Not like someone trying to prove something, just like someone who meant it." It was the closest she had come to expressing pride. Nathan smiled. "I did mean it." By the end of that year, Silent Courage had expanded into more than just a blog. Readers began requesting more interactive formats, Q&A sessions, live readings, even video essays. After some hesitation, Nathan began experimenting. He recorded short video reflections from his dorm room desk, each one focused on a different theme: failure, vulnerability, rebuilding confidence, speaking while scared. The format was simple, just him, a single camera, and his voice. There were no effects, no background music, only clarity. The response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in from students, teachers, young professionals, and parents. People shared how his words had helped them confront fears, speak up at work, apply for jobs, forgive themselves. One person wrote, "I used to think courage had to be loud. You taught me it can be quiet and still powerful." Nathan read every message. He replied to as many as he could. He no longer questioned whether his voice mattered. He no longer apologized for its softness. One afternoon, while preparing a new video, he received an email that made him sit up straighter. It was from a high school principal in New Jersey. The subject line read, "Keynote Invitation." The message was brief but direct. The school had followed his work for several months. They were hosting a leadership day for juniors and seniors. Would Nathan be willing to deliver the keynote? It would be the largest audience he had ever addressed, over 400 students, faculty, and guests. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he said yes. Preparing for that speech took weeks. He returned to old journals, reread early blog posts, listened to past recordings. He didn't want to repeat himself. He wanted to capture what had changed, not just in his voice, but in his understanding of what it meant to use it. The speech he wrote traced his journey from silence to sound, from fear to presence. He titled it simply, "Speaking Anyway." When the day arrived, he stood backstage, watching rows of students file in. His heart beat fast, but it didn't race. He felt alert, present. Ms. Barlow's voice returned to him. Preparation, not perfection. He breathed deeply and walked out when his name was called. The stage lights were warm, the room quieted. He began. He told them everything: the failure, the shame, the hiding, the writing, the slow crawl toward belief. He spoke not to impress, but to connect. He told them that embarrassment doesn't have to be permanent, that fear can be a signal, not a stop sign. That finding your voice doesn't mean speaking without fear. It means speaking anyway. When he finished, the auditorium stood, a standing ovation. He looked across the sea of faces, and in the front row saw the principal, teachers, and dozens of students wiping their eyes or nodding silently. For a moment, Nathan stood in the hush that followed applause, not out of pride, but out of awe. Awe at how far his voice had traveled, at how it had grown from a whisper of survival into something that could move a crowd. After the event, a teacher approached him. That, she said, was more than a speech. It was a gift. Nathan thanked her, unsure what else to say. Later, as he packed his notes and slipped out the side door, he smiled, not because he had finally become the speaker he once thought he had to be, but because he had become the speaker he was always meant to be, not loud, not flawless, but honest and heard. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, nestled between a campus newsletter and a spam message offering a discount on textbooks Nathan would never buy. He almost missed it. The subject line was simple, professional, and strangely understated. TEDx Invitation Inquiry. He stared at it for a moment before opening it, unsure if it was real. But it was. The message came from the organizing committee of a regional TEDx event in Chicago. They had come across his blog, his videos, and a recent article that had circulated within educational networks titled, "The Courage to Speak When You're Afraid to Be Seen." The committee was planning a theme around transformation through vulnerability, and his name had come up in internal conversations more than once. Would he be interested in delivering a TED Talk? His first reaction was disbelief. His second was panic. He read the email 3 times, then closed his laptop and sat in silence. He had spoken to classrooms, panels, even auditoriums, but this was different. This was a stage with a red circle and a worldwide audience. It wasn't just about speaking to a room, it was about capturing an idea worth spreading and delivering it with precision, clarity, and emotional truth. It was everything he had grown toward. And still, it terrified him. He didn't respond immediately. For 2 days, he avoided the email entirely. He kept himself busy, writing, editing, filming a short blog video, attending classes. But the thought of that invitation hovered behind everything. He knew what it meant. He knew how far he had come from the boy who stood trembling in front of his high school classmates. And he knew how deeply this opportunity would test everything he believed about his voice and what it could carry. On the 3rd day, he replied, "Yes, I'd be honored." The planning began quickly. The event was 3 months away, which felt both far and impossibly close. The organizers scheduled video calls, provided guidance on crafting the talk, and walked him through the structure. No more than 18 minutes, no slides unless essential, and above all, a clear, original idea. Nathan proposed a topic that had lived inside him for years, but had never fully found its form: the legacy of embarrassment. They approved it. He began writing immediately. The early drafts were messy, unfocused. He knew what he wanted to say, that moments of shame, when reflected on and understood, could become milestones of growth, that the very experiences we try to bury are often the ones that make us real to others. But he struggled with how to begin, how to frame the story in a way that was honest, without sounding like a redemption arc plucked from a feel-good film. He returned to the beginning, the speech that broke him. He wrote about it, not as an anecdote, but as a moment that shaped the direction of everything that came after. He described the trembling hands, the forgotten lines, the cold walk off stage. He included the whisper that had pierced deeper than the laughter, Claire's voice saying, "Don't embarrass yourself." He didn't vilify her. He didn't blame her. He simply told the truth. As the weeks passed, the talk took shape. He practiced relentlessly, first alone, then with a coach assigned by the TEDx team. He paced his dorm room, marked timing notes on his script, rehearsed gestures, adjusted tone. The pressure was immense, but it was different from the pressure he once feared. This wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about honoring the journey. 2 weeks before the event, he received confirmation that the final guest list had been approved. The audience would include educators, students, professionals, and creatives from across the state. And among them, as a surprise organized quietly by the team, was Claire. She had accepted the invitation sent by the organizers without telling him. When he found out, he felt his chest tighten. They hadn't talked deeply in months. They kept in touch, sent occasional updates, shared family news. But the moment that had defined so much of his inner life had never been revisited. She had never asked what really happened after that speech. He had never told her how deeply her words had landed. They had skirted the subject, as siblings often do, with a quiet truce forged in shared history, but not in understanding. Now, she would be in the audience. He didn't know what to feel: fear, gratitude, dread, maybe all of them. The day of the event arrived. The venue was a restored theater in downtown Chicago, the kind with high ceilings and red velvet curtains. The TEDx branding was prominent, the signature red dot centered under a soft spotlight. Speakers and organizers buzzed backstage with final checks and nervous pacing. Nathan sat quietly, script in hand, eyes closed. He had memorized every word. When his name was announced, the applause came in a steady wave. He walked onto the stage, hands calm, breath deep. The lights were warm. The microphone picked up the quiet at the start. He began. He told them about a high school boy who had been given a chance to speak and failed in front of everyone. About how embarrassment, when left unattended, grows like a shadow, but when examined, it can become a foundation. He spoke of journaling, hiding, writing in silence. He described the gradual climb from fear to expression, not through boldness, but through persistence. And then he paused. He looked toward the front row. Claire was there. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't cold either. Her eyes were fixed on him, steady and full. He said, "My sister once told me not to embarrass myself, and I did, completely. But I've come to understand that sometimes embarrassment is not the end. Sometimes it is the beginning of legacy." The room held still. He finished the talk, voice steady until the final word. Then came silence. Then applause. Then a standing ovation. He stepped off the stage, heart pounding, but not from fear, from release. He had spoken the truth, and the world had listened. When Nathan stepped off the stage after his TED Talk, the light still burning against the back of his neck, he didn't search the crowd. He didn't rush into anyone's arms. He didn't even speak. He stood at the edge of the backstage curtain, heart pounding not with panic, but with something deeper, an unfamiliar stillness that came from knowing he had said what needed to be said. A production assistant thanked him softly and gestured toward the green room. Applause continued behind him as the next speaker was introduced, but Nathan no longer heard it. The sound faded into the periphery. What lingered was the memory of the audience standing, the final line still resonating in the air. Sometimes, embarrassment is not the end. Sometimes it is the beginning of legacy. He walked slowly to the holding area, not to retreat, but to breathe. The space was quiet. A water bottle sat untouched on the table. His hands no longer trembled. He thought about every room he had stood in. Empty classrooms, echoing dorm halls, borrowed stages. None of them had prepared him for this moment, and yet every one of them had built the foundation beneath his feet. He sat down and closed his eyes, not to escape, but to hold the feeling intact before the world rushed in. A knock came at the door. He opened it expecting an organizer. Instead, Claire stood there. She was still wearing the expression she'd had in the audience. Not blank, not proud in the traditional sense, but deeply moved in a way that hadn't yet settled into words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. Finally, she said, "You told that story." He nodded. It was time. "I didn't know you still remembered that day so clearly," she said. "I never stopped remembering," he replied, voice even, not accusatory. "It shaped everything. I didn't mean for it to." "I know." He stepped aside and let her in. The green room was sparse with 2 chairs and a mirror that reflected their tired faces. She sat down slowly, crossing her arms in a way that made her look younger than he remembered her being. "I've thought about that day a few times," she said. "Not because I was proud of what I said, but because I wasn't. I was trying to be funny, maybe a little tough. I didn't think it mattered." "It did," he said, "but not the way you might think." She looked at him. "That moment hurt, but it also pushed me to find something I didn't know I needed. It took years and a lot of silence, but I think, if you hadn't said it, I might never have searched for my voice." She blinked. "I'm sorry," she said, "for saying it like that, for not knowing how much it would matter." He sat beside her. "I'm not asking for an apology. I just wanted you to understand." Claire leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I watched the whole talk, every word. You didn't blame anyone, you didn't spin it, you just us told it. That's the only way it felt right." She nodded. "It was honest. It made me remember things I'd rather forget about myself. That's what good stories do." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. Eventually, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "They gave us thank you cards backstage to leave for the speakers," she said. I wrote something, but I wanted to hand it to you myself. He took the envelope but didn't open it. Maybe later, she said. He tucked it into his jacket pocket. I used to think you were the quiet one, she added, standing. But now I think you just waited to speak until you knew what mattered. He stood too. Maybe. Or maybe I was just scared. Then you turned fear into something that made a room full of people stand up. She looked him in the eye. That's not small, Nathan. She stepped forward and hugged him. Not stiffly, not out of obligation, but with a depth that surprised him. Her arms wrapped around him like someone trying to apologize without words. He returned the embrace, steady and calm. They didn't need to say anything else. Outside, the event moved on. Other speakers took the stage. The audience shifted in their seats. But in that room, a chapter closed quietly. The boy who once stood frozen in front of his classmates had told his story not for applause but for understanding. And the sister whose words had once cast a shadow now stood in the light of his voice, listening not as a sibling, but as someone changed. When Nathan finally returned to the lobby, attendees approached him in waves. Some thanked him. Others simply nodded. He recognized the look in their eyes, the look of someone who had been seen. He accepted their gratitude with quiet grace, knowing the story they'd heard belonged not just to him, but to anyone who had ever felt voiceless. That evening, he returned to his hotel room, sat by the window, and opened the envelope Claire had given him. The card inside was handwritten, brief and unexpected. You turned one of my worst moments into one of your greatest. That's legacy. I'm proud of you, for every word you dared to say, and every silence you learned to fill. Claire. He closed the card, set it on the table, and looked out over the city lights. The full circle was not about vindication. It was about clarity, about telling the story, not for permission, but for peace. In the weeks following the TEDx talk, life began to move forward again. The attention from the event grew steadily. Clips from Nathan's speech circulated across platforms, shared by students, teachers, and mental health advocates alike. His quote, "Sometimes embarrassment is not the end. Sometimes it is the beginning of legacy," appeared in captions and posters, referenced in classrooms and community meetings. People reached out, not only to praise, but to tell their own stories. Moments when their voices failed, when shame silenced them, when they too stood in front of others and forgot everything. Nathan responded to as many messages as he could. He didn't feel like a celebrity, nor did he want to be one. What he felt was responsibility, an obligation to meet honesty with honesty. He wasn't interested in fame, he was interested in conversation. And as his inbox filled and new speaking requests arrived, he returned often to one truth, that his greatest strength had never been in performance but in permission, granting others the space to say, "Me too." Still, despite all the attention, the most significant conversation remained the one he had never really had, at least not until the Green Room in Chicago. He and Claire had spoken briefly since then. They exchanged texts, a few voice notes, and one late-night call that lasted longer than usual. But it wasn't until he returned home for a weekend visit that they finally sat down, uninterrupted, for the first time in years. The house was quiet, his parents out visiting relatives, the late autumn air sharp against the windows. Nathan was in the kitchen, making tea, when Claire came down the stairs wearing an old hoodie, her hair tied back in a way that reminded him of high school mornings before they stopped riding the bus together. She leaned against the doorframe. "Still drink that mint stuff?" He smiled. "Some things don't change." She walked in, grabbed a mug, and poured her own. For a moment they stood side by side, facing the kitchen counter, steam curling from their cups. Then she said, "Can we talk?" He nodded and followed her to the living room. They sat facing each other, no TV on, no background noise, just the quiet of a familiar house and two siblings no longer pretending that time had softened everything. She started slowly. "I've been thinking about that day for a long time, the one at school. I know we talked a little after your talk, but I never really asked. Why did my words stick so hard?" He looked at her, not with blame, but with the weight of memory. "Because they were the last thing I heard before I stepped into the light. I already doubted myself. You just said it out loud." She didn't flinch. He continued, voice measured. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me. I know it wasn't some grand betrayal. But when someone you're close to, someone you watch and admire says, Don't embarrass yourself, it doesn't feel like advice. It feels like confirmation of your worst fear. Claire was quiet. I wasn't brave then, she said. I was trying to protect you by toughening you up. I didn't understand what you were carrying. I didn't even understand what I was carrying. He tilted his head. What do you mean? She laughed softly, without humor. You always seem so calm, so inward. Like nothing could shake you. I didn't realize that your stillness was armor, not peace. I thought I had to be loud to matter, and you didn't play by those rules. It made me nervous. Nathan let that sit for a moment. I never told anyone how ashamed I felt after that day, he said. Not because of what you said, but because I thought I had proven everyone right, that I wasn't meant to be seen. But now you are, she replied. Seen, heard, quoted even. I never expected that, he admitted, but I also never stopped needing it. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes locked with his. I wish I could go back and say something else. He shook his head. I don't. She blinked. You don't? No? If you hadn't said those words, maybe I wouldn't have found mine. Maybe I'd still be hiding, still believing I had nothing worth saying. That pain, it carved something open, something I didn't know I had to face. Claire swallowed. I didn't know how to support you back then. I know, he said, but you're here now. They sat in silence, not the heavy kind that used to hover between them, but something lighter. There was space between them now, not distance, but room to grow. Finally, Claire asked, do you remember the first story you wrote after that day? I do. Was it about me? It was about the feeling, but yes, you were there. She smiled. I figured. You always had a way of turning things into stories. Even the hard parts. It was the only way I knew how to make sense of them. She leaned back on the couch. I used to be afraid that if I ever became the subject of one of your stories, I'd come off looking like the villain. You're not the villain, he said. You're part of the beginning. Claire reached out and took his hand. Not something they did often, not since they were children. You turned that moment into something bigger than either of us. He squeezed her fingers gently. It wasn't just me. You were part of it, whether you meant to be or not. She exhaled. Thank you for not turning away. I did, he said, for a while. But then I wrote my way back. That evening, they stayed up late, talking not just about the past, but about everything that had filled the space between them over the years. Regrets, laughter, choices, moments they never shared. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no tears, no grand declarations. Just the slow, careful weaving of something that had frayed but never broken. By the time their parents returned home, Nathan and Claire were still on the couch, empty mugs beside them, their conversation drifting into quiet. Later that night, as Nathan returned to his old room, he opened his notebook and wrote a single line. Sometimes, the story you feared most becomes the bridge back to someone you thought you'd lost. He closed the notebook, set it on the nightstand, and turned off the light. The conversation they had never had no longer needed to be imagined. It had finally been lived. The months that followed the TEDx talk unfolded with a strange kind of clarity, as though Nathan had stepped through a threshold and left behind not only the fear that had once defined him, but the version of himself who thought silence was the only safe space. Life didn't change overnight. His routines remained much the same, his classes still demanding, his deadlines still stacked. But something deeper had shifted. He no longer questioned whether his voice belonged in the room. He no longer scanned for permission before speaking. The doubt hadn't vanished, but it no longer had the final word. Silent courage evolved from a modest blog into something more structured. With the help of a small team of volunteers, students, educators, and mental health professionals who had reached out after the TEDx event, Nathan expanded the platform into a podcast. Each week, he interviewed someone who had once lost their voice and found it again. Teachers who had failed their first classes, athletes who were benched after public errors, writers whose first books were rejected a dozen times. The theme remained constant: how embarrassment, rejection, and vulnerability were not obstacles to strength, but often the roots of it. Listeners grew. At first, it was just college students and a few educators. Then others began to tune in. Parents listening during their morning commute, high schoolers on long bus rides, young professionals navigating their first missteps. Nathan never tried to turn the project into a brand. He wasn't interested in marketing himself. But stories have a way of spreading when they are told with sincerity, and soon the podcast reached thousands of listeners across multiple countries. Still, amidst the growth, Nathan never forgot where it began. He returned often in his mind to that high school auditorium, to the thin paper shaking in his hand, to the weight of silence after his voice cracked. What had once felt like the end of something now felt like the beginning of everything. He didn't romanticize the failure, nor did he erase the pain of it. He honored it. He wove it into every conversation he had, not as a badge, but as a shared language with anyone who had ever doubted themselves in public. Claire became a quiet but constant presence in this new chapter. She helped edit early podcast drafts, offered feedback on topics, and even co-hosted an episode titled "When Support Doesn't Sound Like It." The response was overwhelming. Listeners shared how they too had misunderstood someone they loved, or how they'd said something careless that took years to mend. Nathan and Claire never overstated their reconciliation. They let it breathe. But they moved forward with the kind of closeness that comes not from pretending nothing happened, but from surviving it together. 1 year after his TEDx talk, Nathan was invited back to his high school, not for a performance or a spotlight, but to facilitate a writing workshop for current juniors. He hesitated at first. The idea of walking through those same halls, of standing in that same auditorium, stirred something deep and still unresolved. But he accepted. When he arrived, the building looked smaller than he remembered. The trophy case in the lobby still held the same dusty plaques. The classroom numbers still followed the same confusing pattern. He was greeted by Ms. Barlow, retired but still involved, now volunteering with student programs. Her hair had gone a little grayer, her voice just as warm. "I always knew you'd come back," she said. "I wasn't sure I would," he replied. "I was," she said, and handed him a folder with the names of the students enrolled in the workshop. "They've read your essay, the original one, the one you wrote after the rejection." He smiled. "That one's still my favorite." The workshop took place in the library. The students arrived slowly, a mix of curiosity and cautious excitement. Nathan stood at the front of the room, not behind a podium, but beside a whiteboard. He didn't begin with a lecture. He began with a question. "What's a moment you wish you could erase? And what might happen if you told the story instead of hiding it?" The room was silent at first. Then pens began to move. Over the next 2 hours, the students wrote. Some cried, some laughed. One student, barely audible at first, shared a story about freezing during a group presentation and how she still avoided raising her hand in class. Nathan listened, nodded, and said, "That was me, and I thought I'd never speak again." After the session ended, the students left slowly, some stopping to say thank you, others too shy to speak. One boy lingered until the room had emptied. He walked up to Nathan and handed him a folded sheet of notebook paper. "I don't want to say it out loud," he said, "but I wrote what you asked." Nathan accepted the paper. "I'm glad you did." As the boy turned to leave, he stopped and looked back. "I thought I was the only one who messed up like that." "You're not," Nathan said. "You're never the only one." Later that evening, back in his childhood bedroom, Nathan unfolded the boy's letter and read it. It was raw, clumsy, full of emotion. And it was beautiful. He placed it inside the same notebook that had carried his first stories. The notebook now sat thick with years of pages, a timeline of becoming. As the sun set outside, Nathan opened a blank page and began writing again. This time, the title came first. Legacy. He didn't define it with achievements or followers or speeches. He didn't list credentials or events. Instead, he wrote about echoes, the kind that begin in shame and ripple outward, changing not only the one who first felt them, but everyone who hears their story later. His legacy wasn't built on a perfect voice. It was built on a broken one that kept trying. And in that trying, something lasting took root, not just in stages or stories, but in people who now stood a little taller because they had heard, finally, that failure was not final, that silence could become strength. That embarrassment, once faced, could lead not to disappearance but to discovery. Nathan closed the notebook, feeling not the end of a journey but the continuation of something much greater than himself. He had once spoken to survive. Now he spoke to build. From shame to legacy, he had walked every step, and he would keep walking, voice steady, story open.